What lower housing inflation gives, higher tariffs will take away. That is the key conclusion that I'm drawing from June's Consumer Price Index report that was released earlier today, and this may mark a turning point in the inflation dilemma that we've seen unfold over the past several years. So at first glance, inflation in June looked quite tame at first glance, but when we take a closer look at the details, which of course I'm going to do in just a second, it is clear that the sources of inflation have shifted dramatically. For the first time in years, housing, which has driven inflation since 2019, is cooling. Meanwhile, imported goods are getting more expensive, and tariffs are the major reason why. So in June, the Consumer Price Index rose 0.3%, while the core CPI, which excludes food and energy, as you might recall, rose 0.2%. Both readings were in line with Wall Street expectations and followed just 0.1% increases in May. Now, on a year-over-year basis, this is where it's getting interesting. So on a year-over-year basis, CPI climbed 2.7%, up from 2.4% increase in May. Core CPI rose 2.9% from a year ago, a slight increase from the prior month too. So over the past 3 months, the core CPI has risen at an annualized rate of 2.4%, which is a significant increase. It shouldn't be underestimated or downplayed. This is a significant increase from the 1.7% pace that was observed between March and May of this year. And that may not sound like a red flag just yet, but it is enough to keep policymakers on edge, and it is enough to keep us worried. There's growing evidence that trade policy, specifically the introduction and the reintroduction and escalation of tariffs, is starting to impact consumers. Goods prices, which include everything from clothing and footwear to furniture and vehicles, made their biggest contribution to core inflation since 2022. And as you know, 2022 was the peak of the post-pandemic inflation spike. So tariff effects usually take months to show in the data. It doesn't, this is not an overnight process, but while service inflation continues to moderate, core goods inflation, specifically in tariff-exposed categories, is beginning to rise. This complicates the Federal Reserve's job, of course, and despite Trump's multiple and frequent and forceful calls for the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, given the latest data, that remains an unlikely scenario. Now let's look at the specifics. Apparel prices rose 0.4% in June, the first increase in that index since March. Prices for window and floor coverings jumped 4.2%, which is the largest one-month increase ever recorded. This isn't random, of course. These are the categories most likely to be affected by tariffs, as the items are typically imported. This is clear evidence that tariffs are being passed on to consumers. And these aren't just isolated spikes either. They're part of a growing trend tied to trade policies and tied to trade tensions. Now, on the other hand, housing, which had been the main driver of inflation over the past few years, is finally cooling. Shelter costs rose just 0.2% in June. That's a sharp contrast from just last year, when rent prices were soaring at record rates. At its peak in March of 2023, shelter inflation was running at 8.2% year over year. And as of June of this year, the latest data recorded, that number has fallen to just 3.8%. Again, the lowest reading since 2021. It's still elevated, of course, compared to pre-pandemic levels, but it is clear that the housing market is no longer the primary driver of inflation. Now, some experts explain the difference this way. Tariff effects are like a broken bone. They're sharp, painful, and immediate. Shelter inflation is more like arthritis, a chronic long-term pressure. Both affect their overall economy, but in different ways and at different speeds. Experts warn that if housing inflation doesn't keep slowing, the overall CPI could drift back up into the 3% range. That is something the Fed is eager to avoid. And so far, their cautious approach, keeping interest rates on hold, seems to reflect a desire to wait and see how things play out. Still, the latest data breaks a streak of slowing inflation, which may be enough to raise eyebrows at the Federal Reserve, especially with President Trump threatening to impose even steeper tariffs on top U.S. trading partners starting August the 1st. If those tariffs actually do go into effect, inflation pressures could build very quickly, and of course, that would head into the fall and into the holiday season. By the way, gasoline prices also contributed to June's uptick in overall CPI, rising 1% after 4 straight months of declines. That gain offsets the administration's frequent claim that lower gas prices would make up for any price hikes from tariffs. At least in June, that didn't hold up. Auto prices told a mixed story too. New vehicle prices decreased by 0.3% following a similar drop in May. Used cars and trucks fell by 0.7%, continuing a downward trend that's helped cap overall inflation. But analysts also caution that if tariffs extend to auto parts and components, as Trump promises to do, that could reverse quickly as well. Now, looking forward, most economists expect more inflation from tariffs to show up in future CPI reports. Right now, many retailers are still selling goods that were imported before the latest rounds of tariffs took effect. And so once that inventory runs out, price hikes may become more broad-based and persistent. So definitely be on the lookout for that. Meanwhile, pressure is building on the Federal Reserve. The White House has been openly forcing Fed Chair Jerome Powell to cut rates, arguing that tariffs are necessary for national competitiveness and won't cause long-term inflation. But the data is beginning to show otherwise, as you can tell. For now, the Fed is holding steady, watching how tariffs impact consumer prices and overall demand. Policymakers face a very tough decision: wait for more evidence of price pressures or act preemptively now to prevent inflation from becoming entrenched again. So what is the bottom line here? Well, inflation has shifted gears. As you can see from this quick data that I just shared, housing inflation is no longer the primary threat. Now it's tariffs and the risk that they pose to the broader economy. If these price increases spread beyond goods into services, the Federal Reserve may be forced to act sooner than expected. As always, the next few months of data, particularly the July and August CPI reports, will be critical, will be very important in shaping what comes next for interest rates and the economy. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you think about the latest uptick in CPI. Is this something that you're experiencing as well when you go shopping, when you purchase your groceries and other items? Let us know in the comments below. We would love to hear from you. Remember to show your support, like, subscribe, and share. Consider becoming a subscriber on Substack and Patreon. I'd love to see you there. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.